Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you can hear me. Yes, the mic is working. Very good. So good evening and welcome to this Bright Blue and Five Talents UK event, Good Britain. For those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we are an independent think tank that seeks to defend and improve liberal society. And I am the chair of that think tank. We believe in a liberal, meritocratic, pro-market, internationalist and institutionalist Britain. And both organisations, Bright Blue and Five Talents, who have partnered today, are united in their belief that entrepreneurship is key to supporting so much individual, family, community, national prosperity, but that we need to support a wider group of people in a wider set of places with the finance, skills and support to take that leap into building businesses. We believe that talent can be found everywhere, but the right opportunities often aren't. So we're very grateful to Hanover Communications for hosting us, particular thanks to Jess and her team, and a big thanks also to Five Talents and to James and Megan in particular for their support. Now, the world feels a more dangerous place, especially as conflicts have come closer to home. The democratization of the late 20th century has reversed somewhat over the past few decades. Authoritarian and terrorist enemies are becoming bolder and more sophisticated in their efforts to undermine liberal democracies. Britain, of course, has never been perfect, but it has played a positive role in the past in building the rules-based and multinational international system, which has been pivotal to the peace and prosperity that has been experienced in the post-war period. It's provided significant military, cultural, legal, commercial, financial contributions to a range of countries. The role of UK aid in particular has helped save lives, transform communities, and bolster sustainable development in some of the poorest parts of the world. In this decade, however, our aid budgets have been reduced and increasingly attacked. We're delighted today to host the Deputy Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell. He has, over the past 14 years of Tory governments, been the key champion and steward of the UK's aid efforts. And in his speech today, he'll be reflecting on the good this country has done in recent decades and his vision for our role in the world in the more dangerous decades that lie ahead, especially in our future international development efforts. He'll speak for about 15-20 minutes, and then we're going to ask some questions, first from me, and then open it up to the floor. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag #BrightBlue. And after the keynote speech and the Q&A, we're going to have some refreshments. So please stay around for that to digest some of the speech and what you thought about it. I'm now just going to hand over quickly to Rachel Lindley, who is the co-CEO of Five Talents, to say a few words and then introduce the minister.
Thank you, Ryan. Can you all hear me? Great. Well, big thank you, first of all, to Ryan and all the team at Bright Blue for pulling this event together. We really appreciate your support. Thanks also to Hanover for hosting us in this beautiful space. And a special thank you to the Minister for joining us this evening, despite the many pressures on your diary. We're really excited to hear what you have to share, your reflections looking back and your vision looking forward. Before I hand over to you, however, let me just say a few words about Five Talents, because I suspect many people in the room have never heard of Five Talents. We actually celebrated our 25th anniversary last year. What began as one man's idea around his kitchen table has, over that 25-year period, supported more than 300,000 entrepreneurs across Eastern and Central Africa. Together, women and men form literacy and savings groups. They learn, earn, save and invest so that they can support their families with dignity, so that they can employ others, so that they can send their children to school and meet their basic needs. Let me tell you about just one of those people. Let me tell you about Lena from DR Congo. Like many women of her generation, Lena didn't have the opportunity to go to school. She grew up through decades of civil war. She married very young. She told us before she joined her Five Talents literacy group, she could see a piece of paper, she could pick it up, but she didn't know what it said on it. She joined a literacy group through Five Talents. She learned how to read and write and count Already that changed her life. No longer was she cheated in the market because now she could count the numbers on her banknotes. Now she could read road signs, she could read the instructions on medicine, she could vote for herself, her opportunities expanded. But it didn't stop there. Lena went on to join a savings group as well, with a group of 20 women. They saved small amounts of money in a pot week by week. They went through some business skills training through their Five Talents partner. And eventually, Lena took a loan and she used it to buy 5 bags of peanuts. She sold those peanuts in the villages around. She made a profit. She repaid the loan. She took another loan to expand her business. And now, thanks to those profits, all of her children are going to school. Those children will grow up to have a brighter future than Lena herself had. And that's what we all want, really, isn't it? A better future for our children than we had, with more opportunities than we had. Lena has even managed to buy some solar panels to put on their grass thatch roof so the children can study in the evenings. You can read lots more stories like Lena's in our impact report. Do please look out for that. Do also take a look at this. This is a longitudinal evaluation of our work in Burundi, our partnership in Burundi, showing how the impacts of these community savings groups get deeper over time. So do have a look at this. I could share statistics and stories with you all night. I'm not going to do that. But before I hand over to the Minister, let me leave you with just one reflection, which is really the secret sauce of Five Talents. It's how such a small charity, we are still a small charity, has been able to support more than 300,000 entrepreneurs. And that secret is that all of our work is rooted in the communities where we are operating. It's all locally owned and led. We follow where the communities lead. We have a phrase for that in our office. We call it the power of what we have. And it's a beautiful phrase because it works on so many levels. We start with the power of what the communities themselves have. Even in South Sudan or DR Congo, places that you might associate with deficit, with lack, we look at what communities already have, and they have a lot. They have entrepreneurial spirit. They have the resilience formed through those challenges. They have the desire to succeed. They have talent in spades. Through our partner trainers, we're able to unlock that talent. The power of what they have comes to life. But it doesn't stop there. We also bring the power of what we have as Five Talents, some technical support, some financial support, thanks to the generosity of our supporters, the power of what you have. But again, it doesn't stop there either. It's about the power of what we all have, what we all bring to the table. And that includes governments and larger agencies as well. Perhaps that's a good moment for me to hand over to the Minister so that we can hear your reflections on how the power of what we all have, the collaborative effort of development, is going to succeed in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Ryan. I think I'm a patron of Bright Blue. I certainly used to be, and it's great to see all the things you're doing and making a contribution to the type of conservatism which you set out at the beginning of your remarks. And it's also great to be here with Five Talents, who I know do brilliant work from as far afield as Bolivia and Myanmar, but principally in East Africa. And you set out very clearly the brilliant contribution that Five Talents is making. Now, I'm not intending tonight, in spite of suggestions to the contrary, to make a very controversial or specific speech, not least because the Prime Minister has made a great speech today about the very dangerous world in which we live. And of course, last week, the Foreign Secretary made not one, but 2 great speeches on the sweep of foreign affairs. But I wanted to try and complement what they have said tonight with a few reflections, as you set out, on the last 19 years since I first got involved in international development, prior to us coming into government in 2010. And between 2010 and 2015, we had the luxury in opposition of mainly sticking with the posts which David Cameron gave us when he became leader of the opposition, and of being able to develop the policy area for which we were responsible. In my case, that was international development. And between 2005 and 2010, we tried to work out what a centre-right development policy looked like. We were very respectful of what Gordon Brown and what Tony Blair had done on development. We like to refer to development policy as a British policy, not Labour or Conservative. And we were very determined to build on the strong base that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and the Labour Party had given us. And we were also conscious, something I remind my colleagues about, that in opposition you can do nothing. You can only say and prepare yourself for the time when you may have the privilege of introducing policies in government. And with this centre-right approach, we determined that it had a number of key characteristics. The first was that development was about building prosperity, and that it was about growth and not charity. And I used to say to the NGO sector that all too often they believed that the private sector was the enemy of development, and we believed that the private sector was the engine of development. And one of the most important things that we did was to reform CDC, the British government's development finance institution, set up in 1947, now called BII. And it's very important to understand why CDC makes such a contribution and why we spent such a lot of time on seeking to reform it. CDC employs approximately, through its investments, 1 million people in the poorest parts of the world. That's food on 1 million tables, potentially. And over the last 3 years, it has paid more than $4 billion of tax into national exchequers. Now, those exchequers may not always spend that money well, but we all know that the golden thread of development is that you need to have strong state institutions so that they can provide basic service for their citizens, whether it's health or education, and that starts with public finance. So that is the great contribution that CDC, now BII, makes, and I will have something more to say about that a little later on. We also prioritized microfinance, but we understood that building prosperity, economic success, having the ability to get a job in the rich world and in the poor world, it's having a job which helps you to elevate your social and economic condition. And just as building prosperity was key to all of this, tackling conflict was key as well. Stopping conflict, starting once it started, stopping it, and once it's over, reconciling people, which was the reason I first went to Rwanda, to see how a society atomized by conflict and genocide could pick itself up and build itself up again. Conflict is development in reverse. And remember that disorder, as we see all the way across that belt of North Africa, disorder is the breeding ground for terrorism, as people fall prey to the terrorist recruiter. And they understand that in a globalized world, not very far away from them, are people living in very, very different circumstances. So building prosperity and tackling conflict, they were the hallmarks of the opposition's green paper upon which we came into government in 2010. And we also wanted to embed the centrality of women and girls in all development policy. I do not believe you can understand development unless you see it through the eyes of girls and women. And we thought that above all reflected on 3 specific areas. First of all, on the area of education. Educating girls is how you change the world. In the opinion of many of us, we set up the Girls Education Challenge Fund, which has run until this year, actually, designed to get 1 million girls into school. And actually, it got 1.6 million girls into school in the most difficult parts of the world where there were not alternative structures. It's about family planning. We had the big summit in 2012. It's saying that girls and women should have the right to decide for themselves whether and when they have children. And it's about gender-based violence, tackling it. And I salute the very good work that my colleague Lord Ahmed has done over many years. So embedding the centrality of the rights and actions of girls and women in development, we recognised was extremely important. We reviewed the spending through the multilateral system, the multilateral aid review. And we said to the multilateral aid reviews systems, 43 agencies within it, some of whom had never been properly reviewed since they were set up in the early 50s. We said we will look at whether you are representing value for money for our taxpayers, and we will see also whether you are pursuing aims that Britain thinks is right. And we did the same thing with the bilateral aid review, reducing the number of programmes from 44 down to 26. And we also were determined that DFID should become a proper Department of State for development in the developing world. And I think we did a lot of good things to fashion DFID into a stronger Department of State than when we found it. And we introduced the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, the taxpayer's watchdog, to ensure that there is value for money, reporting not to ministers, but to the Select Committee in the House of Commons, reporting not to the executive, but to the legislature, so that ministers who can sometimes sweep inconvenient truths under the carpet could not do so in respect of development. And we knew we had to do that because you could not then increase spending to 0.7 without having that degree of taxpayer accountability. And I always used to say to the Daily Mail when they attack development spending, if you think there is something wrong with it, go to the ICAI, because the ICAI is the fearless champion of value for money. And we introduced, as I say, the 0.7. I have never been so proud in all my political life as being the Development Secretary on the day that, in spite of all the austerity and difficulties that were going on, George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced that Britain would stand by its commitments to the poorest people in the world and introduce the promise that we had made. I'm now going to roll on to when I returned to government in 2022, and the Prime Minister very generously inviting me back, said, see what you can do to improve Britain's profile on development, and that is what I tried to do. And although I'm about to present a challenging and pessimistic version of what is transpiring, I want to refer you to an article in the Financial Times, I think just a week or so ago, by Martin Wolf, in which he does show how far we have got. And consider these statistics. In 1820, 80% of all our fellow human beings were living on the margins of subsistence. In 2018, that 80% figure had been reduced to 10%. And this is a different population over that period of time, from 1 billion people to 7.7 billion. And even in 1970, ladies and gentlemen, 50% of our fellow citizens were living in extreme poverty. Now, why has this changed? Above all, I submit, it is because of globalization, and it is because of the external assistance provided by the international system, and in particular, the multilateral development banks. And from 1990 to 2020, we saw the fastest alleviation of poverty this world has ever seen. But since 2020, we have seen the collapse of the international rules-based system. We've had COVID, but above all, we've had Russia invading its neighbor, a sovereign state, brutalizing and murdering its citizens, bombing and destroying its infrastructure, a member of the Permanent Five, behaving in a way that we all thought had been consigned to the history books in the last century. We have seen spikes in energy and food pricing. We've seen inflation. We've seen uncertainty in commodity prices. All of these things directly affect the poorest countries in the world. And remember where the international rules-based system came from. In 1945, at the end of the war, those who were then, if I may use a cricketing metaphor, at the crease of international affairs, they had seen their father's generation slaughtered in the First World War. They had seen Europe and other parts of the world destroyed in the Second World War. They were determined that this massive act of narrow nationalism should not be allowed to happen again. And from there, the international rules-based system was formed. Now, alas, overwhelmingly massacred by narrow nationalism. And at a time when we really need international cooperation to tackle the major problems that we see in our world today, we live in an era of that narrow nationalism. And what are these things that we really need to cooperate on in development terms through the international system? I'll just mention three of them. The first, obviously, is climate change, Britain has been doing its stuff. The Prime Minister announced that we would give the biggest replenishment ever, $2 billion to the Green Climate Fund, and we have taken over the co-chair of that. But climate change is the existential threat of our time, and although we are doing much to help tackle that, we are not doing enough. Secondly, pandemics. We've all seen what happened in COVID. The negotiations on the pandemic are now at a critical stage. And remember, we know that none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And thirdly, on the issue of migration, one of the greatest challenges of our time, I would argue the whole UK development budget is spent in our national interest, building safer and more prosperous societies over there, so people don't feel they have to flee from where they were born, where their community is, to safer countries. Building safer societies at the heart of British development policy. And also the prosperity agenda to which I referred has been seriously damaged. It's been much more difficult for countries now to mobilize resources, and in particular to mobilize domestic resources. More than a third of economies in the developing world are in the informal sector. There are tremendous shortages of foreign exchange. There's a dependency on foreign lending. We have seen a rise in debt distress, and the G20 common framework mechanism is not yet working as well as we would wish. And corruption, the cancer in development, continues to destroy so many initiatives. So those are the problems. And what we have tried to do in the 1.5 years since I came back into government is firstly trying to make the merger work, to try and ensure that there is a structure within the British government, within the Foreign Office, which can deliver global public goods into the 2030s. We have a second permanent secretary, a senior official now, who is responsible for international development within the Foreign Office and the government. The development minister sits as part of the cabinet, has the governorships of the multilateral development banks, and is on the NSC. And we have set up the Star Chamber, co-chaired by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and the Development Minister, to try to ratchet up the quality of aid and ensure that this taxpayers' money is really well spent. And we have set up UCDEV, the platform between civil society and between the government, to try to work more seamlessly on demonstrating why this work, why international development, why this budget is so important. And it is one of the most exciting changes that we have made. And we have published a white paper designed to act as a roadmap for how we get the SDGs back on track by 2030. At this halfway point, they are way off track, and how also we ratchet in money into climate finance and turn, in the words of Mia Mottley and the Bridgetown Agenda, billions into trillions. The most important aspect of the white paper is that it is effectively an all-party white paper. In the unlikely event later this year that there is a change of government, an incoming government will be able to see it as a rock on which the continuation of development policy could be pursued. It is trying in the white paper, above all, on the issue of climate finance, to answer the question, how do you use statist money, that is money from the DFIs and from the multilateral development banks, whose assets and balance sheets we are sweating in every way we can? How do you use that statist money in connection with the private sector and above all with pension funds, of which we know there are something like $60 trillion? How do you use that statist money to de-risk and augment what the private sector can do so that people are willing to invest because they understand both the risk and also the rate of return? The white paper champions R&D and science, And quite rightly so, when you visit, as I did, the Jenner Institute in Oxford and see the development work going into these wonderful vaccines, most recently malaria, you can only be lost in wonder and delight at what they are achieving. And on BII, a very important pledge in the white paper, BII will increase from 37% of their investments, which the effect of which I described earlier, from 37% to 50% what they invest in poor countries. That may not sound very much, but it is a huge challenge, and they are absolutely intent on delivering it. Last November, we held a food summit to show how we can do development differently, and we have settled the position on the 0.7, returning to 0.5 when the two key tests are satisfied, something the government is committed to. And as far as I can see, the position of the Labour opposition is precisely the same. But because of the shortage of money, we have invented a number of multipliers. Those multipliers do not score as ODA, so they're not part of the 0.7, but they have a dramatic impact on the amount of money that goes into the system. Britain has issued £6 billion of guarantees, particularly to the World Bank and the African Development Bank. That's £6 billion, which do not score as ODA. We have used insurance to ratchet money in, and insurance is now paying out both in weather-damaged parts of Africa as well as in the Caribbean. We are doing co-financing with a number of countries. That means where we share similar ideas about where we want to work and similar ideas about the themes we want to pursue, we are effectively able to give the British taxpayer 2 for 1. It's a bog-off arrangement, buy one, get one free, and it is a key multiplier. And don't forget either that the announcement by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, last year about the use of SDRs, Britain pledged $5.6 billion worth of SDRs to pro-poor endeavours by the IMF. Now, I want to end my remarks by noting that in this very fractured world, which I described, where the international rules-based system has been under such a great challenge, where we have the crisis in Ukraine and the crisis in Gaza, there is always a danger that humanitarian need elsewhere could be neglected. And that is why Britain has announced that it will put £1 billion on the table this financial year to pursue our humanitarian obligations and duties around the world. And also in the white paper has invented the Resilience and Adaptation Fund, the RAF, which will mean that wherever there is a humanitarian disaster, we are able to put additional money, 15% of whatever we are spending on that humanitarian work, on the table to build in resilience, so that the next time these crises happen, and we know, alas, that they will, the population affected by them will have some resilience and some resistance. The best example I can give you is that there have been areas of drought where we've had to move water by lorry. But if we're able to use this new fund to build methods of water retention, reservoiring, irrigation, and so forth, we can try and ensure that the next time the crisis hits, it isn't so bad. And these masked crises include in Sudan, where a huge number of the population in this vast country is displaced, where humanitarian need is extraordinary and where famine conditions are growing. I was able to see for myself the people fleeing across the border from Sudan into Chad just a few weeks ago, and meet some of these people and hear how a combination of climate change and conflict had driven them, only in the clothes they were wearing, across the border to seek sanctuary in Chad. But also in Ethiopia, where there are signs of famine conditions in parts of Ethiopia, we have tried to move preemptively to stop the dreadful prospect of that which happened 40 years ago, when Bob Geldof tweaked the conscience of the world. We've tried to move there to forestall this by a major pledging conference in Geneva just a fortnight ago, co-chaired by Britain and Ethiopia and the UN system, which raised £610 million to try and stave off these conditions in Ethiopia. So we live at a time of great challenge, great difficulty, very different, I submit, from the position in 2010 when this government came to power. The challenges are immense. We are meeting as many as we can. We know what needs to be done. There is a degree of party unity going forward, which I hope will ensure that Britain is able to reassert itself as a major friend of the dispossessed, a country that really cares about these colossal discrepancies of wealth and opportunity which disfigure our world. And I hope that all of you will join in this collective effort by Britain to make sure that we are there at the crease, scoring runs, if I may return to my cricketing metaphor, in this vital area of British public interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for that very thoughtful speech and for sketching out very detailed and compelling vision going forward for international development, for which the bedrock is the white paper, which has recently been published. I've got a few questions and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. So I'm going to try and make you as honest as possible, but I realise that may be difficult as you are a government minister, but I will try nonetheless.
And a former government whip, of course.
Yes, of course, complex. The most important one. So looking back over the past 14 years in terms of UK aid policies and programmes, which do you think has been the most effective and transformational? And which do you think actually the learning is that wasn't great? It wasn't impactful. It was the wrong thing to do, but we've learned the lesson. So best and worst.
Well, it's a very interesting question, not least because in development you have to be willing to take risks with what works. And I would argue that the two most important things we have done is the reform of BII. BII, when we came into government, had 47 staff. It had become a fund of funds. Indeed, Tony Blair tried to privatise it, which would have been a catastrophic mistake. But it had become a fund of funds. It had 47 employees. As we were reforming it, it got down to 17. Today, it has over 600. And it is doing remarkable work around the world. And I hope very much that the all-party approach to BII will continue, because it is a massive way of alleviating poverty, which is sometimes both misrepresented and misunderstood. So that was a very important measure we took. The other one I would single out is the one I mentioned, which is the Girls' Education Challenge Fund, because it was particularly focused on areas where the state could not provide education and where there wasn't any form of institutionalized education. So often it was bringing in completely new structures, and it was very expensive. So the cost of getting those 1.6 million girls into school was greater than in other schemes because it was tackling the hardest and most difficult places. So those would be the two that I think have been most successful. I mean, you know, my comments about the merger when I was on the backbenches cannot be unsaid, and I wouldn't want to unsay them. But I think, you know, I think collective responsibility, as I've said when I came back into government, is not retrospective. But I think that the merger has been very challenging. And I think that the question is whether or not we can deliver this, what I described as a sort of agency champion global public goods into the 2030s. And I have to say, I think the jury is out on that, though the fact that David Cameron, who really has a deep and abiding understanding and affinity for these issues, if he and I can't do it together, that would be quite a telling sign.
So one thing I want to talk about now is it seemed from what you were saying that a lot of big achievements in energy happened particularly in the coalition government days. And actually a lot of criticism, which is levelled not just on aid, but across different policy areas, is actually a lot of the energy and newness, whether it be on welfare, education, was in those early days. And actually it's become more difficult, not least because of external shocks, COVID, Brexit, to kind of implement more of that sort of new radical stuff. And I'm just thinking about aid. You know, we know that UK aid now, the budget is 0.5% of GNI. There's calls for more of that aid money to be directed towards biodiversity and climate efforts. More of the money from analysis seems to be spent on refugees and asylum processing. So do you feel that actually it's become more difficult to really champion aid and do the big, bold stuff in the latter period than in the earlier period?
Yes, but that's not because of, or it's at least only in part because of decisions that we have made. I set out how different the world is now to what it was in 2010. You know, I talked about how we'd made this extraordinary progress from 1990 to 2020 and the challenges which have emerged since 2020. And the fracturing of the international rules-based system, the way it's been smashed by the activities of Russia and by the growth of narrow nationalism. So I think the position is very different now. And also, you know, government is difficult. People get fed up with governments when they've been a long time in power. But it's always, you always have, I think, have to be wary of believing that a change of government will change some of these fundamentals, because it won't. And you know, this will be, I'm getting towards the sort of discussions we'll all be having about who is best to chart the course of Britain in an extremely dangerous world, which I believe the world is at its most dangerous point at any time in my lifetime. So I think that the complications and the difficulties are made by the many changes that have taken place since 2010, huge changes, the effects of COVID, the impact of what's happened in Ukraine, the impact of climate change, particularly on international development, where people who used to flee across borders normally did so because of conflict, but now increasingly are fleeing away from where they were because of the effects of climate change. I'm thinking of the way the crops have failed in key parts of Africa, including in Ethiopia, just before the lean season takes a grip. So these are complexities which are much greater now, and did not exist in anything like this form in 2010, and we have to adapt within the constraints of what we can do. And you know, we spent £400 billion during COVID on supporting families and jobs and people from the effects of COVID so that they could get through. It was a great deal of money. It was one of the most successful schemes in the world. It was thought about and run and organised by Rishi Sunak. I think it was the right thing to do. But clearly, if you take those actions, you fetter what you can do in other areas as a result of that spending.
So right at the start of your speech, you talked about some distinctive centre-right approaches to international development. And just reminded me of the Steve Hilton saying about, we want a big society, but a smaller state, and we don't want a overly bureaucratic big government. And I'm just interested in aid because there seems to be a debate about whether money should go direct to individuals, whether that's through grants or microfinancing, and whether that's more effective than doing it through bureaucracies or organizations in particularly poor countries. So I'm keen to understand what you think about the evidence there and whether it is effective to go straight to people directly, whether you can do that and that gives more value for money.
Well, it's a very interesting point. I think you have to do both is the answer. But at the World Bank, Ajay Banga, the very brilliant president who is now there, he has decided that there needs to be much more of that sort of social protection, the providing of money to people on the ground. It's something that Rory Stewart also champions, and I think that's what you're referring to. So, and as a result of that, he thinks the evidence suggests that the World Bank could as much as double what it does in respect of that social protection, the provision of money to very large numbers of people on the ground. I mean, when I was in opposition, I went and looked at this with care. My starting point was it sounded like a form of unemployment benefit, and I was against it. I went to Ethiopia to see how it operated on the ground. I was completely converted. It is a very good way. You can understand that if you have an area where food is very scarce, you put money in people's hands, then merchants will come with markets to provide food because they will realize there's purchasing power there. And there's lots of other ways of looking at that argument too. So I think it is both, but I think the value of that is more keenly understood now. And that's why the president of the World Bank has made the comments he made just a few weeks ago.
Very interesting. And you talked also about migration and the increased migration that Europe and the UK is experiencing. It's often said that aid, giving more aid is a way of reducing those migration flows. I'm interested in the evidence on that. Is that the case, or is it the case that you build up the prosperity of a particular area, individuals become richer, they become more aspirational, they perhaps become more mobile? So I've heard the argument say better aid leads to reduced migration from some countries which have suffered historically. Is that true?
Well, I asked the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Lady Scotland, and also the Secretary General of the Francophonie, former Rwandan foreign minister, on separate occasions, what they thought was the key issue which had to be addressed in Africa. And they both said exactly the same thing. They both said jobs for young people. And we had a very interesting and successful meeting in Lancaster House, where we gathered together some of the best brains in Britain to see how you could advance through that agenda. And I think that's very important as part of the answer to your question. Now, leaving on one side the fact that it is true that if you elevate a little the economic condition in a very poor country which is conflict ridden, there will be a lift in migration as a result, because they have the capacity to migrate. But that is only that is a phase in the journey. Once a country is doing well, once it's got an economic pathway in front of it, which it's on, then people do not tend to migrate. And then, of course, later on, as you see in many African countries, people will sometimes come with their skills and use them in the developed world. And of course, we see the return of remittances in respect of that, which results. So I do believe that, as I put it, that trying to build safer and more prosperous societies over there means that people do not have to leave their own country to try and find a more prosperous country. But violence, as the Archbishop of Canterbury said about the fighting in Ethiopia last year, can lead to hundreds of millions of feet marching north to look for a better life and a better society. And I remember talking to people, in the Syrian camps around Syria who had fled from Syria. Remember, in Syria, half this second world country really were on the move. Half of them, about 5 million people inside Syria internally displaced, 5 million in the camps around in the countries like Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey who looked after them, and 1 million who came across the sea. And the thing that we learned was, if you ask the people who've come out of their country and are in camps around what they want to do, they want to go back when they want the fighting to stop so they can go back to the area from which they have been driven. That is the first thing they want to do. They don't want to have to go across the sea in a leaky boat, paying the modern day equivalent of the slave trader to deliver them on a foreign shore.
And then a final question from me, and I'll open it up, which is, you talked very positively about a cross-party consensus on aid policy in the years ahead. Now, Lord Cameron was asked whether he would serve as Foreign Secretary under a Labour government. Not asking whether you'd serve as Deputy Foreign Secretary, but would you help?
What did he say?
He denied it, but George Osborne said it was a sort of non-denial denial. So interested in, the question is, would you support Labour, not necessarily as Deputy Foreign Secretary or Minister for Development, would you support a Labour government in some kind of role with this policy area?
Well, I'm a Conservative member of Parliament. I represent the royal town of Sutton Coldfield. I have very fixed views on development. In my own party, when I disagreed with my own party, I was not shy about making that point. And the converse of that is if a government of another party, in the unlikely event that one was to be elected, were they to pursue a policy of which I approved, I would give it support. And on international development, I do think that party divisions, unless absolutely essential, are very irritating and annoying for the public. We should speak with one voice where we can. That's the great advantage. It's why I used to say when we were in opposition that I thought it was a British policy and not Labour or Conservative. And if we are to achieve what the new second permanent secretary is charged in his job description to do, which is to increase by 3% each year support for international development out there, if we are to achieve it, we will do it much more easily on an all-party basis.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Right, let's open it up to questions from the floor. If you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. We do have a microphone, so people are watching on the live stream and need to pick up that question. So please wait for the microphone to come to you. So we'll start with this gentleman here, just here. And again, if you could make your questions very pithy, that would be great, because the Minister is constrained on time.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks all of you. And thanks, Minister, for your remarks and your leadership so far. And particularly you mentioned Sudan. Thank you for your leadership on particularly mass atrocity prevention there and your continued efforts on that front. My question, to be pithy, is making the connection between international development and the buildings over there, the city, and particularly the profits that individual people make, whether they be Russians or South Sudanese, from conflict, which we have a great assets in this city, which could help prevent those profits, help prevent people from making profit from conflict and therefore perpetuating them. What more could be done, perhaps for very little money, by improving that collaboration, say, between the Treasury, the finance sector, and development to try and reduce those drivers of conflict.
Great. And without being rude, who are you and where you're from? Great. Let's do a round of three, and we'll take this lady here.
Hello, my name is Lydia Painter and I work at Malaria No More UK, so was very excited to hear you mention the malaria vaccines, and obviously we know that as a minister you were instrumental really in getting the UK to pledge for the Global Fund's latest replenishment, that there is a concern with the upcoming Gavi and Global Fund replenishments that donor markets around the world are not committing the money that is needed, and we know that it's a big ask. We know in the sector there are competing priorities, but thinking about what you said about value for money, so much has been spent on developing these amazing vaccines, and it feels like even if you put sort of the moral argument around saving lives aside, if we don't get these British developed vaccines to the people who need them most because we don't fund Gavi and the Global Fund properly, that's a huge waste of our resources and of the effort that's gone in.
Right, thank you. And then this gentleman here. Just here, look. This man.
Thank you. David Bendred, a supporter of Five Talents, but also a former staff member at CDC BII in the distant past, and really pleased, Minister, to hear your sort of strong endorsement of what BII has achieved in the last 10, 15 years and the transformation that it's had. My question is actually on a slightly sort of different tack, and that's around the sort of role of China in Africa, particularly, and the sort of massive growth of Chinese influence and Chinese investment that we've seen in Africa since 2010. And what do you really see as the sort of risks from that, and what more can we do as Britain, given the budgetary constraints and all the other constraints that you've that you've talked about.
Great, thank you. And then I'm just going to take a final question from this gentleman here, and then the Minister will take the.
Hi, good evening, Minister. My name is Jaisal. I am an economics teacher. I suppose me and my students, my A-level students, would like to know that when Britain sets its agenda for aid and international development, what criteria does it use in order to focus its efforts? Is it sort of Commonwealth nations by default? Is it sort of which governments are willing to kind of cooperate the most, or is it part of any trade deals that the UK government would make as to how much sort of aid and development would be a part of that, if at all?
Great, thank you very much, Minister.
So number one, Nick, I think on dirty money and the use of the city to crack down, because the city is such a big international financial centre. I would make really two points. The first is that we are sanctioning people now. We are using the powers that we have. We've done a lot of that sort of thing, and you've seen what we've done about Russian oligarchs and so forth. So we are, where we can do so legally, we have to be careful always to get the legalities right. We are doing as much as we can. On the issue of dirty money, it's important to recognise that Britain has a dog in the fight. According to some estimates, 40% of money laundering around the world, this is often money stolen from Africa and Africans by corrupt businessmen, bent politicians and warlords and so on. 40% of that money comes through London and overseas territories and the Crown dependencies. And that is why in 2016 at the G8, David Cameron made the attack on dirty money and the importance of open registers of beneficial ownership so front and centre of that G8. And Britain has now taken steps to ensure that Companies House is more effective, isn't just a sort of library, and we are doing much more. The Crown dependencies and the overseas territories have not yet done as much as they must do. And I think that with David Cameron as Foreign Secretary, we will see a greater emphasis now on introducing these open registers of beneficial ownership. Europe is moving, countries in Africa are moving, even America has recently moved in this respect, although not to open registers, but to closed registers. And we are very determined that we must play our part. If these overseas territories and Crown dependencies want to have our king and our flag, they must also accept our values, which is why we are so intent on ensuring that dirty money can't flow in there and from there. Very interesting question from the lady from Malaria No More. Let me assure you, the replenishment for the Global Fund was exceptional. Look at what Peter Sands, the chief executive, said about it. We have always been tremendous supporters of Gavi. In 2011, we did the Gavi replenishment in London. It raised a phenomenal amount of money and raised even more on the subsequent recycle. And remember that 83% of people in Britain approve of vaccinating children under the age of 5. So it's very, very good expenditure. Indeed, Bill Gates believes it's one of the best forms of expenditure you can have. And we will be talking later on this year about the next Gavi replenishment. And I hope you will be pleased with what we're able to do. David, thank you for your comments about BII. On the role of China, the issue is this: China's not Russia. Russia's role is almost entirely malign in Africa. And they're out for what they can get, and they're not really interested in helping in the people there. China is much more complex. And when I was in government before, when I visited a country in Africa, I used to ask if possible to see the Chinese ambassador, and indeed we did some stuff together on infrastructure in the DRC, China and Britain as well. And I was looking at the projects which China has supported in Nigeria over the weekend. And they are quite an impressive list. And remember, when the Chinese communist leader summoned all of the African heads of state to Beijing for a meeting, they all went. And he announced that time that he would increase by $100 billion the amount of trade between Africa and China. These are good development outcomes. And as the Foreign Secretary has made clear, we need to have a constructive relationship with China that is completely open. We say where we disagree, but where we agree on issues of climate change, for example, we must try and ensure that we cooperate for the greater good of mankind. So it's a nuanced picture on China, but when they behave in a way that we think is unacceptable, as they have done recently across a number of issues on international affairs, we need to speak out without fear or favour. And finally, Jay, how do we put together the way in which we fund? And I should make clear that this year we are able, because we have the budget under proper control, to effectively double the bilateral programs around the world. We look at need, we look at poverty, we look at British historical involvement and interest. And under the International Development Act, there are very strict rules about how aid is both administered and committed. I think that there's obviously, by definition, it's not all science. Some of it is, how we feel and what we've done in the past and how we assess the quality of what we're doing. It's a complex, multifaceted matrix, but a lot of thought goes into it. And I do think, we get it right. There are countries which we support because we know that the lives of people there are desperately poor, desperately miserable, and it is a call on our common humanity to help. And there are countries with deep historic links with Britain, where that relationship, sometimes through the Commonwealth, is one we greatly respect as well.
Thank you, Minister. Lots of people are very desperate.
One more
questions. Oh, you'll take one more.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, this lady.
Hello, thank you. My name's Waris Mahad. I'm a representative of, I represent United Somali Initiative, which is the official UK representative for SSC Khartoum State, which is located in Somalia. And just want to turn our attentions to the Horn of Africa, which I know is an area that is deeply, something you're deeply interested into. The region I'm specifically representing is a recently autonomous region and has been recognised by the Somali government. And we've been doing a lot of work to try and to do a lot of progressive politics, particularly around women's political participation. And my question to you is how do you see the UK's women and girls strategy stay a priority and transcend governments?
Well, it's a very good question, and it definitely is a key priority. I wear the band, which I was given by a lady who runs a brilliant anti-FGM charity in Somalia, in Mogadishu. And when I was there just over a year ago, looking at the way in which we do develop, because obviously it's a very complex and difficult place to achieve results. One of the things I was very pleased to see was the way in which the priority we place on women's and girls, the work that we're doing there was being pursued and prosecuted in these very difficult circumstances. So I think I can certainly assure you that we have every intention of continuing. We won't be put off by the inevitable barriers we face. And I'm sure you have all the right links here, but in terms of the work inside Somalia, you will never make a mistake by talking to our embassy there and the people there who are very much engaged in the development work we do.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Like I say, do stick around. We're going to have refreshments. Thank you to people watching on the live stream. I don't know where the camera is, but I know it's somewhere. Thank you for watching as well. A big thank you to 5 Talents UK for partnering with us. We're grateful for that partnership. And very interesting to hear all that you're doing. And as I say, as was said earlier, please do look at the materials which are on your chairs. Thank you to my team, particularly Emily, for helping to run this event. And if you're interested in more of our events, we've got another one on Wednesday with the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, which is on the future of finance. So it does touch on some of the things that we discussed today. And finally, if we could give a round of applause to the Minister. Thank you.